So in this video, I want to talk about drama. If you've seen my images, they're dramatic, they're moody, they're usually dark. That's just how I like my images to look. So what I thought we'd do today is take a really bland image and see how we can create some mood, create some drama, and just walk through some steps in Photoshop. It's pretty easy to create a dramatic image, if you nail it in the field. Your composition's locked on, you get really nice light, nice weather conditions. That's easy, right? So what we're going to do is take an image where none of that happened for us, and we're going to see what we can do while post-processing to really bring out some nice drama, some nice mood. So I really think you guys are going to like some of the stuff we do in this video. If you do, feel free to like and subscribe. We have a lot more content planned. We're really excited about some of the videos we have coming. But let's get into Photoshop and create some drama. Okay, so this is the image we're going to work on. Now you can see it's very plain, right? This is the raw file. This is not a dramatic shot by any means. The sky doesn't have a lot of contrast. You can see it was very gray. There's not a lot of texture. There's not amazing light. The landscape's very flat. So just looking at this image, yes, the landscape is absolutely beautiful, but there's not a lot of mood. There's not a lot of drama. So what we're going to work on is adding those two things to this scene. Now we're going to do it through post-processing here, but all the things that I show you, if you do get dramatic conditions and you have a dramatic composition or a really nice composition in the field, all these things that I show you are still things you can do in your image to kind of emphasize that drama. And we're going to break it into 3 steps. So step number 1, we're going to work with light. We're going to work on the tonality of the image. We're going to work with bright and dark tones to kind of draw the eye where we want it. Step 2, we're going to work with color. So we're going to do a little basic color grading. And then step 3, we're going to create depth. Now, again, if you use these principles and follow these steps, you can create drama in your images as well. And it's even easier to do when you do have those dramatic conditions. So just a warning here, this will be a more intermediate to advanced Photoshop tutorial. I'm going to be using luminosity masks. I'm going to be doing a lot of masking. I am going to be using this plugin here. This is the TK Basic panel. It's a free plugin. It just creates luminosity masks very quickly. So I'll put a link to this in the description. I am going to be using this during the tutorial. Okay, so let's get into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab a curves layer, and I'm just going to grab a point and darken the image down. Now I want to start with a very dark canvas, because what I'm going to do is kind of build light into the scene. So I like starting dark because it allows me very precise control over where I want light added to the scene. There's a lot of areas in this image that I might just want to remain dark. And that's going to add to this dramatic look we're going for. Darkness, really, if you want a dramatic image, darkness is your friend. So I'm just going to darken down the image, and we're going to add light where we want it. And that just helps you kind of keep that moodiness and that dramatic feel throughout your processing. So I'm just going to start with that. We'll darken down the whole image. And now I'm going to target the sky. So I'm going to grab another curves layer, and I'm just going to darken. I'm going to pull it down to darken the sky, maybe at another point down here. And I'm just going to pull down a little bit, and you can see that adds a little bit of contrast. So here's before, here's after. Now, obviously, this looks really, really bad on the rest of the image. So what we're going to do is add a layer mask. So I'm going to hit Control or Command I with the mask selected to the right. And I'm going to grab my quick selection tool by pressing W, and I'm just going to make a really rough selection of the sky. So with that selection made, I'm going to go up to Select and Mask, and I like to do this just to kind of fine out my edge. So I'm going to use the Refine Edge brush tool. I'm not going to change any settings, and over here you can see red indicates what is not selected or what's masked out. So if I zoom in here, so I'm going to use this brush because you can see, there's a little bit of weird, not perfect blending happening on the edge here. So I'm going to take the Refine Edge brush tool, and I'm just going to brush over the entire edge. And it doesn't need to be perfect, but it's just going to help kind of keep the landscape separated. So if we look at that same area, there's really nice feathering now between what we want selected and what we don't. So I'm going to click OK, and there are marching ants. So I'm going to press B to toggle my brush. We're going to grab a white color, so I'm going to press X. That's a really quick shortcut to switch these two colors, and we're using black and white so much when we're doing layer masking. So with white selected here, I'm just going to paint in that adjustment. And I'm going to step back. Let's maybe lower our opacity to say 75. And I'm just going to paint that in. And I can hit Control or Command H to hide those marching ants, and it just gives me a better look at what I'm actually doing. So that looks pretty good. I actually think I will lower the opacity. I'm going to switch to black, and I'm just going to bring back some of the brightness on the horizon. And that's going to make more sense a little bit later when we actually try to build some light here. Okay, let's check that out. So here's before, here's after. So 2 adjustments, just darkening the image, and it already looks more dramatic, right? But it is underexposed, so we have to fix that. So let's do some dodging and maybe a targeted mid-tone adjustment to kind of bring the foreground and the glacier to life here. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a blank layer. I'm going to change the blending mode to overlay. And I am going to attach a midtones layer mask because that's going to help me just restrict my brush strokes to really the areas that I want light. And it's gonna help me control my brush, so I'm not like dark areas down here, so I'm not affecting dark areas in the scene. I'm not affecting the dark mountains, and that's really what I want. I want to bring light to the ice, but nothing else. So I'm going to go up to the TK Basic panel. I'm going to select Midtones 2. And there's 3 midtone selections. I find that the second just happens to be the best for targeting midtones. And if you want to add some nice contrast to your image, the midtones is really the place to do it. So with the selection active, I'm going to choose selection. That's going to bring my marching ants and make it an active selection. And I'm just going to add click the layer mask button here. And now I'm going to grab my brush tool. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option. I'm just going to select a color in the ice. So you can see whatever I select, it's going to add that color to my brush color, my primary brush color right here. So I'm going to double click and I'm just going to fine tune this. You can see it's very dark, not a lot of saturation. So I'm going to bring it way up so we have a lot of brightness, 100%, and around 20% saturation. I'm going to click OK. And then let's start at around 50%, and I'm just going to paint over the ice. And again, what's nice about the midtones mask is I really don't have to be too concerned with my brush strokes because the midtones layer is keeping it restricted to, it just does a really good job of just selecting, the brighter areas of the ice in the foreground. So let's just look. Here's before, here's after. It's looking pretty good. Now I can see that I've had a little bit of this color blend in or bleed into the sky a little bit. You can see here's before, here's after. So what I'm going to do is actually put this layer in a group. I'm going to hold Control or Command G, and I'm going to add a layer mask to the group. Now I'm doing this group because I don't want to paint my brush stroke on this midtones mask because you can see it's a perfect mask. I don't want to do any freehand strokes because it's going to mess that mask up. So instead, I'm going to come up to the group, and again, I'm going to press W and just make a quick selection for the sky. I can go into select and mask again, just make sure that edge is kind of included. I'll click OK. Now I'm going to press B to bring my brush back. I can hit Control or Command H to hide those marching ants. I'm just going to paint black to mask that out. So now if we look, here's before, here's after. So I don't have that nasty blue color in the sky. So that looks pretty good. I think we might do another targeted midtones adjustment though. I think this time I might select my midtones. Again, toggle it as a selection, and I'm going to go up to curves. And whenever I have an active selection, it's going to automatically add it to that layer mask with whatever adjustment layer that I select. I don't want this in the group, so I'm just going to drag it above. And I'm just going to grab a point and pull up the brightness a little bit. And I'm just kind of looking at the foreground. We'll fix this really dark area, this black wall up here in a little bit. So here's before, here's after. So this looks really good for the foreground and the midground now. So if let's do a total before and after. Here's before, here's after. So it's already looking more dramatic. And again, we've just worked with light and a little bit of color. We'll do more color in a little bit, but we've added a tiny bit of color via our dodge. And it's looking, we've got some mood, we've got some drama now. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is work on the sky. I want to create this illusion that there's light kind of bleeding through the horizon. So I'm just going to grab a blank curves layer and add a lot of brightness and a little bit of contrast as well. Something around here. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to hit Control or Command I, and I'm going to grab my brush again, make sure I have white selected so I can paint white on my black mask. And I'm going to choose an opacity of like 20%. Now I'm just going to paint this adjustment in on the horizon, just to kind of create this illusion that we actually did have some nice light and the sun was kind of coming through. And I'm going to show you a really, really cool thing that we can do to kind of blend this perfectly. Okay, so here's before, here's after. So that looks nice on the sky. You can see it's bleeding over though into our landscape. So watch this. This is really, really cool. We can right click here on the layer, go to blending options, and we're going to do something called blend if. So this is an easy way to pull an adjustment out of your blacks or your highlights, or your blacks or your whites. It's similar to using a luminance range mask in Lightroom. So what I'm going to do is go over to my blacks because I want to keep the sky adjustment out of those darker areas of the image so it doesn't look unnatural. Because you can see it's bleeding into the glacier here. It doesn't look very good. So I'm going to hold down Alt or Option, and I'm going to go to my black point sliders on the left. And when I hit Alt or Option, it's going to separate that slider. And now if I move it to the right, you can see the adjustment was kind of pulled out of those areas. So here's before, here's after. And I can come in here, grab that black slider and kind of fine tune it, maybe somewhere around there. So here's before. You can see all that light bleeding in, that adjustment bleeding into the landscape. Here's after. So I'm going to click OK. And now here's before and after the whole adjustment. Another thing I can do to kind of refine that is I could go up to blending options again and keep, I could try the underlying layer now, which seems to be working pretty well for this area. And I did the same thing. I just hit Alt or Option. And this is kind of how I process. I'm always coming back. I have to fine tune things, and that's how it should be. So I'm going to click OK. Here's before, here's after. And if I really want to clean that up, with my layer mask selected, I can choose black as a brush. Let's bump up the opacity. I can just paint that out of the glacier. So here's before, here's after. So some nice light now. And now I think the last thing before we move on to color is we'll bring up some of the blacks because we're just getting a little bit too much, dark areas in the background. So I'm going to go into the TK panel. I'm going to choose one of my dark luminosity masks, probably darks 2 here. I'll choose a selection. I'm going to go to curves and I'm just going to increase brightness a little bit. Something like that, and that's making everything too bright. So I'm going to add a group, Control or Command G, and then I'm going to add another layer mask and invert it. And now I'm just going to use my brush at a low opacity to kind of brush in where I want that adjustment to be applied. So this is a little bit better. Here's before, here's after. We've just kind of balanced the scene. This looks pretty good. Okay, so let's keep working on that light in the sky, but this time I think we're going to maybe switch to color. So what I want to do is add some warmth to that light. So what we're going to do is grab our a color balance adjustment. I'm going to drag it above the group here. And with color balance, I can target shadows, midtones, or highlights. So I'm going to choose highlights, and I just want to add warmth. So a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, and all I'm looking at is just the area right here, because we're going to use a layer mask to restrict this adjustment. So let's just say, we're probably going to have to refine this. Let's just say something like this. So I'm going to invert the layer mask, grab my brush tool. Let's do very low opacity, like 20%. And I'm just going to paint in some of this adjustment. And I'm going to try and match up, where I was doing some of that horizon brightness. So something like that. We're actually going to use that same blend if mode. So we're going to come up to our color balance. We're going to right click, choose blending options. I'm going to hold down Alt Option for this layer and underlying layer. And again, that's just going to pull out this adjustment from our dark area. So here's before, here's after. You can see the adjustments removed from the dark areas here. And it just makes this look a little bit more realistic, right? Because we obviously didn't have this color or this light in the sky. So I'm going to click OK. And here we go, before, after. So now we're starting to add a little bit of color. So let's continue working on that. I really want to cool down this whole image because we're going to try and create this contrast, this transition of cool to warm. So we want ice is very cool, sky cool, and then we have this warm spot. That's going to create a dramatic look. That's going to create mood, and the eye is going to go right up the glacier to that warm light. So I'm going to grab another color balance layer, and I'm going to add a lot of blue, maybe a little bit of cyan, something like this. And then I'm going to, again, invert the layer mask, and with about a brush at around 50% opacity, I'm just going to paint this in where I want it. And let's maybe add a little bit more cyan, something like that. And I'm really just going to use this to, I'm going to paint this adjustment really on the foreground, maybe a little bit in the sky. And paint this on the glacier too. And I might come in here and just kind of fine tune it a little bit. So maybe something like this. So here's before, here's after. You can see really, really cool now. So it is looking like a little too much, but I like these settings that I've dialed in. So I actually might come over to opacity and just dial the opacity of the layer back a little bit. So here's before, here's after. So let's look at these color adjustments. Here's before, here's after. So you can see we've really created a nice mood with color, right? And it's looking more dramatic because we have these contrasting colors. We have the contrasting tonality of dark and light, and then we now have added the second layer of contrasting colors of cool to warm. Now we can always come back to light and work on it a little bit more. So if I wanted to, I could grab another curves layer, brighten things up, invert that layer mask, and then around 20-25% opacity, I could just kind of work in, keep building on that light that I've kind of been trying to create, and really just brightening up that background as a whole. So let's look. Here's before, here's after. So that looks pretty good. Yeah, so I think it looks pretty good. We might make an overall adjustment at the end, but now let's look into creating depth. So one of the easiest ways to create depth is using clarity and detail and sharpness to your advantage. So if you think about being at this scene in person, these icebergs that are 5 or 10 feet away, they're going to be really, really detailed. Now, as we transition to the background's probably going to be a little bit more soft. All the particles in the atmosphere and things just being further away, the background's going to be a little bit softer, more diffuse. So what I'm going to try and do is just kind of emphasize that transition, that high detail, which we already have here, to more diffusion, lower detail. So we're going to add a variation of the Orton effect, and we're going to try and open up the background a little bit. So the first thing we have to do is create a stamp. So this is a complicated keyboard shortcut. It's Control or Command, Alt or Option, Shift, and E. And this stamp is going to create a copy of everything underneath, and it's going to give us a new pixel layer that we can add filters to. So I'm going to go up to, we're going to go up to Filter and add a blur, but first we're going to add a little bit of brightness and contrast. And these are kind of arbitrary numbers. You just want something that's brighter and has more contrast. So something like that, click OK. I'm going to go up to Filter, I'm going to go to Blur, I'm going to go to Gaussian Blur. Now, usually when I'm doing a true Orton effect, I like to be around the resolution of my camera. So, you know, I'm working with a Nikon Z7. It's around 45 megapixels. I usually am at 45 to 50 pixels. For creating depth and diffusion, I kind of up it to around 100. So I'm going to click OK. Now you can see we just have this, you know, this big blur here. So I'm going to add a layer mask. I'm going to invert it, and I'm going to grab my brush, and at a very low opacity, like, you know, we can start at 10%. I'm going to build in some of that adjustment. So I'm going to paint it over the background here. On the horizon, we're kind of building light, maybe over the glacier a little bit. I don't want too much, but maybe somewhere around there. So here's before, here's after. Now, if that's too much, I can just dial down the opacity of the entire layer. But look at what's happening. Lots of sharpness, right? And just adding a little bit of a blur. It's really not taking away too much clarity, but it's creating this transition between high detail and low detail. And it's also adding this illusion that there's, you know, some nice atmosphere in the scene. It's just separating the foreground from the background. And that's going to help add drama, and it's going to help add mood as well. So here's before, here's after. Now, if I wanted to still work on the foreground, you know, I could always go back into the TK panel and look at my midtones, maybe grab a midtones 3 here, pick selection, go to my layer mask, and really bring up the brightness a little bit. Now, I really like how the midtones kind of target, they target the brighter parts of the midtone, so you get a nice uniform, you know, brightness. It adds more brightness to the areas that are already bright. It keeps the darker areas a little bit darker. Now, I don't want the whole image affected, so I am going to put this in a group, and I am going to add a layer mask and invert it, and then using my brush at around 50% opacity, I'm just going to paint it back in. And you can use the numbers on your keyboard to really quickly dial in opacity. So for instance, if I want to switch to 20%, if I press the number 2 on my keyboard, it switches it to 20%. So that's just a quick way you can kind of you know, change how much your brush stroke is applying. So here's before, here's after. Looks like a little too much, so I'll come back into that curves layer. Maybe something like that. So if we look at these 2 layers, here's before. Well, sorry, let's look at all 3. Here's before, here's after. So again, it's subtle, and it should be subtle, but we have created a little bit of depth, and that's helping create this dramatic feel to this image. Now, I think what we'll do for the last adjustment, I'm happy with what we did with tonality, I'm happy with color, and I'm happy with what we did with depth. The last thing I'm going to do is create a custom vignette. So I'm going to grab a curves layer, drag it to the top. I'm just going to darken down the whole image, and I'm going to invert that layer. And now using my brush, I'm going to paint white, and I'm just going to darken down the areas that I kind of want hidden from the eye. And I call this a custom vignette because instead of doing like the classic, you know, radial filter for a vignette, you can really control where you want the darkness applied to, and that's going to help kind of control where the viewer's eye goes. All right, so let's look at my vignette. Here's before, here's after. So you can see the eye is definitely coming more central now, right? So the last thing I like to do when I'm working on an image is I'll create another stamp. So Control Command, Alt Option, Shift, and E. So I'll create a stamp at the top. And one of my favorite things to do is go up to Filter and go to Camera Raw Filter. And this has everything. This is Camera Raw, so very similar to what you see in Lightroom. And I like this because after I make all these specific adjustments, I can come into Camera Raw, I could say, all right, maybe I want to adjust the exposure a little more, or maybe I really want to cool it down, something like that. I can do all those things. So I really like, being able to come in here and say, maybe my shadows need to come up. Maybe I need to boost my highlights a little. I can just make global adjustments very quickly. So, something like this, and I can click OK. And, here's before, here's after. So now it's a little bit more polished. So let's just do a total before and after. This is what we came into Photoshop with. Very plain image, not a lot of contrast, not a lot of drama at all. And this is what we have now. Just do it again, before, after. So I would say this is much more dramatic, right? There's a mood in this image. It's more interesting. And again, we did a lot of processing here. And, I said in the beginning, it would probably be fairly heavy-handed, and it was. But these principles you can apply to your own images and your images where you've actually, waited for the light and got that dramatic light, and you have your composition dialed up. I really think it comes down to 3 things if you want to create a dramatic, moody image. Tonality, so working with darkness and adding light where you want it. Working with color, so kind of color grading your image so you have a nice cool to warm transition. And then creating that depth. And I know the depth adjustment was very, very subtle, but it did create, this transition from detail to lower detail. And that's going to add that 3-dimensionality to your scene. And then we finished up with just a vignette and some global adjustments. But, I really like what we did with this image. We just do one final before and after. You can see we have really nice colors now. The eye is going to go up to the light. We have darkness hiding a lot of where we don't want the eye going. And I think this is a dramatic image. So I hope you guys learned something in this video. Check out these techniques, apply them to your own images, and see what kind of results you can get. So thanks for watching, guys, and stay tuned for our next video. Take care.